Stephanie Fauch, Vice President of Outreach and Communications at USIP. I would like to say once again, thank you to Secretary Baker for an extraordinary speech this morning. It was something we all needed to hear, so thank you so much. And on behalf of our institute and the Baker Institute, I want to welcome you to what should be a very lively and perhaps provocative conversation about the impact of U.S. diplomacy since Madrid. First, a bit of housekeeping. I hope I don't need to remind you to please silence your phones. Now to our panel. Our moderator will introduce our distinguished panelists. She'll lead the conversation, and then at the end of the discussion, she will welcome your questions. But it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our moderator. I'm sure Margaret Warner is well known to all of you as a co-host of the PBS NewsHour. She is one of our country's most distinguished journalists, and she is an indefatigable journalist. She maintains an international travel schedule that honestly I think would exhaust at least 3 normal human beings. In the last 2 years alone, she has reported from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Russia, France, Britain, Germany, China, Kenya, and Iran. And I'm sure I'm leaving a couple of places out. She won an Emmy in 2008 for her coverage of Pakistan, and that's just one of her many awards. So you are in extraordinarily good hands. I am going to vacate the podium and turn the discussion over to Margaret, and I think we will have a very, as I said, lively and perhaps provocative conversation.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much. And it's great to see such a big crowd. I know we have competition, and to have Secretary Baker here, and Susan Baker, and also Nabil Shott, and many other players from Madrid. You all know the title of this panel. I suppose what it really is why hasn't Madrid been replicated? And the official title is The Impact of American Diplomacy in the 20 years since Madrid. I think it's fair to say that the negotiating record since then has put very few lasting scores on the board. You had the Oslo Accords in 93, you have the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty in 94, but really, even why was never implemented. And so I know that Secretary Baker gave a very tough address on this earlier, and at the plenary you heard from several of the regional players. So now we have 4 distinguished American policymakers and analysts to look at really the same thing. And 4 of our panelists, among our 4, 2 were at Madrid, and you all know them. I'm going to just be the briefest of intros, and I'm sorry I'm not mentioning any of your books. You're all prolific writers. I'll stipulate to that. So I'll start with Sam Lewis right here. He was not at Madrid. He had been U.S. ambassador to Israel under both Presidents Carter and Ronald Reagan, and he returned to head this Office of Policy Planning at State in the Clinton administration. Next to him, Dan Kurtzer, who was a senior member of the delegation at Madrid, and went on to serve as ambassador to both Egypt and Israel, and he's now professor of Middle Eastern Policy Studies at Princeton. Aaron Miller, also a member of the U.S. delegation at Madrid, and served, as his bio always says, as a Middle East advisor to 6 secretaries of state over the course of his 20 years at the State Department. And he is now a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And Shibli Telhami, who is, I would say, the noted expert on public opinion in the Arab world. He's he holds the Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, and just returned, he told me, from 3 weeks in the region. This panel, as all others here, is on the record. I hope that won't inhibit frank discussion. We're going to go about, 35 minutes or so, but we want to leave about at least 35 or 40 minutes for Q&A from this audience. So let's get right to it. And Dan Kurtzer, I'm going to begin with you. Now, you co-wrote a book in 2008, and you basically said it looked so promising after Madrid, but that since then, quote, the record is largely one of failure. Now, I don't think most people here would disagree with that. But later in the book, you go on to say that the record really, quote, reveals an alarming pattern of mismanaged diplomacy. Can you explain that?
Sure, thanks. The book, Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, was done actually under the auspices of this institute, and it was designed to be a kind of mini manual for learning lessons from the past and then applying them to the future, and trying to understand both the strengths and weaknesses of the three administrations that we analyzed, that of George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush. And we did find an unfortunate pattern of diplomatic failures, failure both to articulate strategy and then to pursue it, not a blind strategy. In other words, not strategy that is pursued even in the face of obstacles, but a strategy that's amenable to a change, that's agile, that has porous boundaries. Second, we found a pattern of lack of monitoring and accountability. You know, the parties in this region have accepted a lot over the years, agreements, the roadmap for peace, and yet there has never been an effective way instituted to monitor their behaviors, hold them accountable for their failure to do what they committed themselves to do, and then to exact consequences for that failure. And so once the parties understood this, that there was no reason there were reasons to avoid fulfilling responsibilities, the behavioral situation on the ground, whether it's terrorism and violence on the part of Palestinians or settlements and inhibitors to mobility on the side of Israel, became rampant problems. And the third issue, I mean, there are many in the book, but the third big issue that we looked at was the fact that there were so many meetings that were ill-prepared. Take, for example, just in the year 2000, there were 3 major U.S. summits that year. A U.S. summit with Syria, Camp David, and then a U.S. initiated summit at Sharm el-Sheikh designed to bring an end to the Palestinian uprising that had begun the month before. None of those summits was prepared adequately. And if you contrast it, for example, in a lessons learned mode to what preceded the first Camp David, in the months preceding that Camp David, I see Hal Saunders is in the audience, he would know better than I, the United States had done a tremendous amount of homework, including the preparation of a draft at Leeds Castle that was used as the starting point for what became the Camp David Accords. That didn't exist at Camp David. The United States did put forward a draft on day 3, I believe it was, and when both the Israelis and the Palestinians found fault with it, we withdrew it, and it never reappeared. So it's not just, as Nabil Shah suggested this morning, that terms of reference going into negotiations are important. If you're going to call a summit, it better be well prepared, including the substantive issues that are going to be discussed at that session. Now, one could raise the question of whether Annapolis, in fact, followed this pattern. And I would argue that it, in fact, did. Annapolis was a very ill-prepared summit. The United States could not even get the two parties to agree to the opening statement or even a modest set of terms of reference. And yet the parties themselves, having not negotiated for almost 8 years, went off on their own and did a tremendous amount of negotiating. But then the argument would be, where was the United States? We now, or in the next day or two, will see former Secretary of State Rice's memoir, and we're seeing excerpts from it which suggest that she tried very hard during her shuttles to the region to try to bridge some of the gaps. But if it's an honest autobiography, which I assume it is, it'll also indicate that she did not have support from the president or from the White House, from the vice president, to do what needed to be done. And if there was one lesson among the many that we can take away from this conference about Madrid, it was the degree to which the Secretary of State had the full confidence of the President, not to make decisions without reference to the President, but being able to employ the power of the United States in diplomacy in helping the parties bridge gaps and overcome differences. And I think a reading of this past couple of years, when the Palestinians and Israelis came very close to reaching an agreement, will indicate a great degree of responsibility on the United States for not exercising the power of diplomacy because of this inhibition on the part of the White House to do it.
That's quite a bill of particulars. Aaron Miller, your view on this. Is it a lot of real mismanagement on the part of the United States?
I spent the better part of the last 6 years beating up on myself because I am part of the problem that Dan referred to, at least throughout the Clinton administration. I'd say a couple things. Number one, the degree of difficulty. It's like the Olympics, professional diving. The judge evaluates the degree of difficulty of the dive. Now, with all due respect to the incredible diplomacy that drove Madrid, the degree of difficulty of what subsequent administrations have dealt with in comparison to what the masterful diplomacy of the Secretary of State in Madrid, it can't even be compared. Now, Dan would argue rightly that should require more preparation. He's 100% right. The Camp David Summit of July 2000, and I was there at both briefings of the president, and he went around the room to his credit and said to everybody, this is a good idea. By the way, the invitations had already been issued, so our assessment wouldn't have mattered. But when it came to me, instead of saying what I believed, which was, Mr. President, you have to go to this summit, but listen to what I'm telling you. You will not reach an agreement there because neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians nor you are adequately prepared to make the kinds of decisions required. I responded the way everyone else at the table responded, which was you have to go, you have the ghost of Yitzhak Rabin on one shoulder, you've got the ghost of King Hussein on the other, you've got 6 months more, you care about this issue, there's a chance. And when we walked out, he said to us, trying and failing is better than not having tried at all. And at the time, I was inspired, but that is not right. That is an appropriate slogan for a high school or college football team. It is not a substitute for the foreign policy of the United States. So what has been missing from this process, many things, is the cruel and unforgiving assessment of what needs to be in place before a summit. Two real summits in 50 years of American diplomacy, both at Camp David. One succeeds and one fails. There's a reason there have only been 2 summits, because you don't take a president to a high-wire act like that and without some certainty. Sam will tell you that there was no certainty at Camp David, but the chances of an agreement, it wasn't just possible, it was probable. It was not probable at Camp David, and it has not been probable through the last 8 or 9 years. We've been failing for 16 years, 8 under Bill Clinton and 8 under George W. Bush. During the Clinton administration, I would argue we over-involved ourselves. And during the Bush administration, Bush 43, we under-involved ourselves. We have not yet found the right balance for American diplomacy. And one final comment, just to drill down, I haven't given up on this.
Let me get to that. Let me first hear, Sam Lewis, let's go to you next. Your assessment of what's been wrong with the whole way the United States has been handling this for really 20 years, certainly since Oslo.
I was thinking, just as Aaron was talking, about this question of why Camp David 1, which I took part in along with Hal Saunders, who was key drafter there, and Camp David 2, which I observed closely from afar. And certainly the preparation was quite different. One thing that wasn't different from what you just said, though, Aaron, I think what was really lacking the second time around was the presidential quarterbacking was not adequate. Bill Clinton was under the spell of both Rabin and then later Ehud Barak. And he put his own judgment too much, I think, in the hands of the Israeli leaders as to what was possible and what wasn't. Jimmy Carter was quite different. Interestingly, Margaret, when I was president here at the time of Madrid, just before Madrid, we actually did a study, it's a prelude really to the one Dan wrote, looking at the whole history of the peace process from the Six-Day War, actually the War of Independence, on up to date, pre-Madrid, and the lessons learned from that period. And the same lessons are learned from both periods. The consistency between the lessons is quite fascinating. And one of them clearly is that presidential leadership is not just leadership. It's a crucial element in America's ability to translate its power and its influence into actual results. Clinton didn't even come to this very seriously until well after Oslo. And Oslo kind of fell into his lap in a certain sense. But it was after Oslo, I think, that the question of implementation and follow-up and responsibility, which was referred to in Dan's remarks, became really relevant. Because we hadn't really been instrumental in producing Oslo, but we had blessed it and we had promoted it, and Clinton made it saleable to the world, and we elaborated it. But we really left the implementation up to the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the monitoring was not adequate, and the result, and they didn't insist on it, either side. So the lack of American leadership at that point in the follow-through, I think, was one of the big issues post-Oslo. I happen to think Oslo was a great achievement, by the way. Not only because it was the first real mutual recognition between the two parties, and that was the centerpiece of it, the letter of recognition, but because it started the process of serious negotiation about the details on how to turn the territory over to the Palestinians. And you brought Arafat back from the cold into the territory and the rest of it. So Oslo was a big achievement, and it soured largely, I think, because of, the demise of Rabin, which was the greatest blow to the peace process, and that's certainly not anything you can blame on U.S. diplomacy. But it also soured because of the beginning of the Intifada technique of suicide bombing, which began actually very soon after Oslo, and was a recurring theme then for the rest of the decade, and finally blew the whole thing up after Camp David II. One point I would like to stress: the complementary roles of the President and the Secretary of State, extremely close with President Bush and Secretary Baker, almost two fingers of the same hand. In the Carter years, Cy Vance was a very powerful partner and implementer of Carter's strategy and contributor to it. I never had the feeling that Secretary Christopher, for whom I worked, had the same kind of relationship with Clinton, or it was not a partnership in the same way. Clinton was really too much in charge of the details and not enough in charge of the strategy. And he didn't have an instrument like Secretary Baker to do the tough work of carrying out the strategy in the field. So I think this question of how this pairing of leadership works is one of the perhaps not well enough understood stories of this era.
And a very human story. Shibli Tahami, what's your theory of the case? And from what you've discerned about Arab public opinion over this period, how has Arab public opinion's view of this changed?
Well, it's interesting. Let me first weigh in on the conversation, and then I'll talk about Arab public opinion. because I think we all agree that leaders matter. I think the differences in leaderships matter, and Dan and I and Scott Lisinski and William Quandt and Steve Spiegel have a forthcoming book on American diplomacy since 1989, in which we clearly emphasize the importance of leadership in teams, and certainly Secretary of State Baker looks good in historical perspective from sitting out and looking at it analytically. But I want to emphasize not that element, really, because I think we shouldn't underestimate the shift, the strategic shift that has occurred globally, that has transformed the environment.
That's right.
Nimrod Novak this morning said something really important, and I think it is something that we need to contemplate. He said, the world in which we can't do more than the parties want versus this is the national interest of the United States. These are two models where either you define the issue as vitally important to the U.S. and you pursue it and you do it because that's what's good for America, no matter what the parties want, versus you end up getting stuck, you walk away from it. And I think these are two important models. Now, some of that happens by choice. That is, leaders make a choice. I'll give an example of that. Some of that happened because of the end of the Cold War. And let's not underestimate that. I mean, I think in the environment in which Jimmy Carter was operating during the Cold War, in which the issue was defined as strategically important to the U.S., there was a consensus even in Congress. It was an easier case to make with the Soviet threat. When Bush 41 and Secretary of State Baker were operating, it was winding down the end of the Cold War. They did have a lot of empowerment from the Iraq War. But contrast that with Bill Clinton getting elected and on the slogan, it's the economy stupid. And if you look at the analysis of, that whole period, that whole era of American foreign policy, people saying international policy isn't going to matter anymore. It's going to be domestic politics. And frankly, domestic politics was going to always be, weighing in more in favor of Israel. And when Israel had the advantage in the status quo, that was going to be the case. So if you look at actually one of the interesting findings about even the Clinton diplomacy, while it is true that from the first administration to the second administration, Clinton, A, learned a lot, and B, suddenly spent more time on this issue, it never was the case, at least in our finding, that he truly defined this as a vitally important issue to the United States of America that required making an assessment of consequences of failure involving interagencies. It was more about this would be good for the world, this would be good for the Arabs and Israelis, this is good politically, this is good for my legacy. And I think if you have that attitude, the likelihood that you're going to expend the leverage that you need to expend is small. Now, some of that is by choice. The example of that choice is when you go to George W. Bush after 9/11. Here is a president that overnight becomes 90% popular in the United States. The American people say, you're the commander-in-chief, you lead us, you tell us what the priorities are, you tell us what's good for America, we'll follow you. He decides to take us in the Iraq War direction. Had he decided that this issue, Arab-Israeli peace, was at the core of the problem that we're facing, he would have had the American people behind him. He could have persuaded Congress. He could have taken us in a different path. Now, that clearly is a choice, and I think there was a choice along these lines that could have been made. Those choices could not be made. This president came to office arguing and maybe believing that it is strategically important to the United States. We don't yet know whether he didn't fully internalize what that meant, or whether he was too weak to proceed because of all the bad hand that he was dealt, namely the terrible economy and disentangling ourselves from war in Iraq and so forth, which made his hand a lot weaker. Now, on Arab public opinion, it's fascinating because when I became aware of this kind of end of Cold War consequence for the United States and the Middle East, it was just when Secretary of State Baker was in office, and I was advising then Congressman Lee Hamilton, who was then the chair of the subcommittee on Europe and the Middle East. I went to the Middle East in the spring of 1990 to learn about how the people in the region are viewing the end of the Cold War. What is the consequence in their mind? And what triggered that was a speech that Saddam Hussein had given in February of 1990. at the so-called Arab Cooperation Council, in which he said specifically that the end of the Cold War would be terrible for the Arabs because now we don't have the Soviet Union. The U.S. is going to be pro-Israel because of domestic politics. And I found in Arab public opinion that exact same conclusion, whether it was in Egypt or in Jordan or everywhere else. That was really the intellectual conclusion of the Arab world. Today, I think it's still the conclusion of the Arab world. In some ways, in the 1990s, Arabs have come to accept that, but they believe that even with that, there might still be a possibility of American diplomacy that takes account both sides. I think at the moment, it's very bleak for American diplomacy. I think that the problem has become not only a sense that America is weak and too weak to produce, but also the credibility of the U.S. has diminished so much that it's very hard to see responsiveness to American diplomacy in the short term.
Shively, let me interrupt that because I want to get to where we're going. But let me first ask, okay, everyone here seems to agree it has to do with political will, effective political leadership, and a lot of mistakes. But, Aaron Miller brought up degree of difficulty. How much, or can you assess also blame on the fact that throughout this 20-year period, you've never had a truly willing partner, a partner with both political courage and political standing on each side at the same time?
Margaret, if you weren't going to make this point, I was, because we're having, in a way, we're having this is a thought experiment in some respects. The reality is that a successful American diplomacy, and there are no exceptions to this rule, flow from two sets of factors. One, there is a degree of urgency which is generated usually by those who live in the neighborhood, either acts of war, insurrection, or statesmanship. It is the confluence of that urgency and the toughness and skill of an American administration who actually is committed to this problem that produces successful diplomacy. And there are no exceptions. Kissinger's disengagement agreements flowed from the 73 war. Carter's peace treaty flowed from Sadat's initiative. Oslo flowed from a Palestinian insurrection. The Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty flowed from Oslo. Madrid flowed from a brief moment where the United States was viewed as the most credible, powerful, and trustworthy partner. Your point, the absence of ownership, what I would call the absence of ownership, Larry Summers' notion that in the history of the world nobody ever washed a rental car because you care only about what you own. And I would argue to you, Dan, I know, and we're going to have this discussion, but it'll be a good TikTok. Ownership is generated, in my judgment, by two things, pain and the prospects of gain. You don't have either of those. I don't care what we want. I don't care what we do. We are not going to succeed. And that problem has to be squarely faced by any would-be mediator.
But then which is it? I mean, it can't be both a failure, Dan, Kurtzer, to go to you, of American leadership, but conditions were not right. I mean,
one of the truisms that I hate is the idea that opportunity knocks. Opportunity never knocks. You create opportunities. And as difficult as problems are, and I would not disagree at all with Aaron, that the substantive challenge of overcoming differences of view on settlements in Jerusalem and refugees was of a different magnitude than the challenge of overcoming the Shamir, Assad, and Arafat by proxy issues at Madrid. There's no question. But unless you create the opportunity to try to overcome those differences, you're letting yourself be guided by the situation on the ground rather than acting on the situation on the ground. No one ever walked into a negotiation with a guarantee of success. But we have walked away or held ourselves away from the possibility of negotiations for fear of failure. And the best example of all may be, as I mentioned earlier, the Annapolis process. I don't think President Bush had any belief whatsoever going into Annapolis that it was going to do anything. You look at the composition of the conference itself. the major Middle East powers of Brazil and Senegal were among those represented at this conference. And yet the Israelis and Palestinians, after 8 years of having fought each other, now found themselves in a situation where they wanted to negotiate. Arafat was no longer with us. And Abbas now had the opportunity to prove that all along he had been in favor of negotiations. We now have 3 sources telling us how close they came. We have Ehud Olmert's book that details how close they came. We have the leaked Palestine papers, I'm sorry to say, Nabil, but we have a window into Palestinian internal documentation. And we have the excerpts that we've seen from Condi Rice's book, all of which attest to the fact that these 2 parties came awfully close on all of these key issues. And where was the United States? Why weren't we there with bridging proposals, with knocking on their doors, with bothering them, with coercion of a positive kind and incentives of a positive kind? I'm trying not to use the word pressures, okay? Where were we? Where were we? We were not there. I really do admire Secretary Rice, but I remember how many of her trips were accompanied by a statement when she landed, "I have not brought any new ideas." Well, what signal are you sending to the parties? If they can't reach agreement through their own devices, and if the one party that may be able to help them is not prepared to put its weight behind it, then you're guaranteeing no success.
So can you answer the question you just posed? Why wasn't the U.S. there?
I'm waiting to read Condi Rice's book. I have a feeling that President Bush, 43, was not interested. And we know from comments made by former Vice President Cheney that he was not only not interested, but he was affirmatively uninterested. And we know that from what Elliot Abrams has been writing since he left office at the Council on Foreign Relations. This was an administration that was at war with itself from the moment that the president actually made an interesting speech in 2002. The president, for the first time, articulates the idea of a 2-state solution, turns the paradigm of peacemaking on its head, and then the administration goes at war within itself, with a group within the administration arguing against what the President of the United States had done. I'll tell you one anecdote from my time as ambassador in Israel. I had told my staff that we were not simply a post office. We were not simply there to deliver messages from Washington. We were value added. And one of the ways to be value added was to, because we're 7 hours ahead of Washington, was to draft press guidance for Washington to think about when it opened up business in the morning. Press guidance, of course, is the articulation of policy on a day-to-day basis. And one day there was this announcement of a settlement, and we sent in press guidance. The entire press guidance was quoting President Bush's speech from June 2002. And I get a call, I'll maintain confidentiality, I get a call from someone in the administration who says to me, "We don't quote the president on this issue anymore." Whoa. Now, as ambassador, who else can I quote? He's my president. So I paid no attention in the future, but it just tells you about the internal war that was going on in Washington over policy.
So we seem to go ahead, Sam Lewis.
I want to hop in on this for a minute because I disagree with 2 things that have been said here and agree with much of what's been said. One is, interestingly enough, Aaron, the Cold War was not the motivation for Jimmy Carter's effort to make peace in the Middle East. Actually, he didn't look at the Middle East that way. His predecessors had, his successors did. But he looked at it as a problem for Arabs and Israelis, and the idea was to help them make peace, and that was good for the world. But this was not a Cold War decision. Now, it's true that his effort to launch a conference was going nowhere, and Sadat bailed it out, and it turned into a bilateral negotiation, essentially. But it was not a moment in which the Cold War conditioned American decisions. So you can, in fact, in a non-Cold War era, initiate peacemaking without having that motivation. I tend to be very critical also of many of the tactical mistakes that my colleagues, ex-employees, at the table here have all made over the years. Two of these three people worked for me at different times, and they were both great, and then they went on to much bigger achievements, but I still think of them as the boys. But I will say this, that I get tired of us Americans assuming that if only we do it right, it can be done. In fact, we need to do it with those who are ready to do it. And we can make it happen if the situation has a lot of ripeness in it. One of the key elements of the ripeness is obviously the leadership on the other side. And you're right, we haven't had an Israeli and a Palestinian leader at the same time with enough political clout in their own communities to make really tough decisions, if they wanted to do so, since Oslo. Arafat and Rabin were the last two. You can argue, however, you had it on Syria with Barak and Assad, because Assad eventually had come around to the point where he was really wanted to make peace. And Barak blew it. We didn't blow it. Barak blew it. And the Israelis who were there now will all admit that's exactly what happened. So we don't control all the cards, is my point. We do control some of them. And it's very hard for the parties to do it without us, but it's impossible for us to do it without them.
Let's hear Shibli on that. Address this failure of leadership or the lack of a synchronicity in terms of leadership on the two sides. I mean, did that have to be fatal to the last 20 years, or could it have been done?
Well, I think it is. I just want to say one thing about the Carter administration, just for the end of the Cold War, because that's a leadership issue. I agree that Carter's interest in the Arab-Israeli issue was partly personal. He actually talks about it, partly religious. Nonetheless, it is hard to imagine how he could have sold the ultimate package to the American people with $5 billion a year and selling it through Congress. He comes to office right after the 1973 war and the aftermath of the Arab oil embargo. All of that is really central, I think, in the American body politic about the importance of the relationship. But synchronization, I think, is important. I think if you want to look at it in historical perspective and say, what changed when Clinton ultimately clinched the Oslo agreements, for example. It wasn't obviously an American initiative. It was actually not at all. But on the Israeli-Palestinian side, that was actually, in my memory, the first time that you had a PLO pragmatic leadership after it had sort of made the switch, coupled with an Israeli labor government. For the first time after, since 1976, right, when Menachem Begin came to office. So I think clearly that is and that's a point that Secretary Baker was making this morning about the need, to have, theoretically, ideally, have a unified Palestinian leadership, have an Israeli government that is prepared for concessions, an American government that makes it a priority. The question, in my mind, though, is not that maybe is required for really making an ultimate comprehensive deal. But if you are the United States of America and you're a superpower and you have vitally important interests, even if you cannot make a final settlement deal, you have interests that you must push. And whether or not you have one party or another that's going to stand in the way, it must not stop you from advancing your vital interests if you believe they're vital. And I think that is what's been missing. In my opinion, what I see it's been missing, perhaps because the issue has not been seen to be vital, perhaps because the incentive structure has been different, perhaps because normally when you have a president or a secretary of state, they come into office not really fully understanding how important this issue is. It takes them a while to learn that it's very important for American foreign policy, and by that time they have other things going on. It's arguably easier for any administration to do it a second term than a first term. Arguably, that certainly wasn't the case with Bush 41. It is arguably easier to do it early rather than late. I think one of the mistakes that this administration made is that He didn't follow Lee Hamilton's advice. Lee Hamilton said that a president is most powerful the first 6 months of an administration. And to do peace in the Middle East, the president needs to be most powerful. And if you let that go by, you're going to find yourself not in a position to make peace.
So very briefly, are you saying that President Obama failed in that he did appoint George Mitchell. It was his first appointment. Are you saying it's because he didn't get, I want to move on here, but just he didn't get personally involved? What was he made it a top priority.
Well, I think the question of to decide what to put on the table, whether it was on the settlement issue, clearly that settlement issue, you can make an argument it was a mistake or not a mistake. You can debate that. But the mistake was once you decided that, you can't back off because that becomes a test of your presidency, a test of your credibility with all the parties, and we know what happened since. In fact, the loss of credibility across the board.
Now, I'm sure there are a lot of questions here. I just want to ask one more quick, but maybe half the time round here so that we're all addressing the same issue. And that is, just this morning, well, first of all, you have the Palestinians now having full UNESCO membership. This morning, it's announced that the Israeli government's retaliating by withholding some of the funds for the Palestinian Authority and also ramping up settlement expansion further. So my question is Secretary Baker right that nothing can happen until the 2012 election and you see change in leadership on both sides? But the flip side of that is, can we just keep muddling along? Or is this reaching a new, potentially explosive stage? And that's a lot to throw into one answer and ask you to do it in half the time. I'll start with Dan.
Let's buy into the argument that's the title of Secretary Baker's book, The Politics of Diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the context of politics on all sides. And so the argument being made today is that the diplomacy is real hard, we may not succeed, and this is a president who, in order to try to get reelected, has to rebuild his bank of credit within the pro-Israel community, much of which he lost. Remember, he got 78% of the pro-Israel or Jewish vote last time around. Now the polls are suggesting maybe 55%. So the argument, the simplistic argument is that the president will spend the next year rebuilding that credit. I ask the question, on what basis will the president be able to rebuild credit if he's already lost the affinity of the pro-Israel or Jewish community for mistrusting him on Israel? It seems to me that a president who started out by saying that a good friend of Israel is going to help Israel make hard decisions because it's in our interest as well as Israel's interest, ought to pursue this to the end of his term. And I don't think it's suicidal. The president wants to get reelected. I respect that. But you're in a half a measure situation now where he has neither accomplished any purpose with respect to the peace process, which he articulated on day one as a national interest, and he's succeeded in losing the favor of the pro-Israel community. So, which way do you want to go? Do you want to abandon the peace process entirely? If so, pull out of the Quartet, announce that we're pulling out of the peace process, and walk away. But we're trying to balance two unbalanceable propositions in a situation where it might work to the president's benefit to act presidential over the next 12 months, not in a suicidal way, but rather in a way that says, I am serious about this. I have examined the first 2.5 years of my policies, and they have not been strategic enough, too much tactics, too little strategy. Here's my strategy, and I run on that strategy.
Let me go to Shibley here next. So, Shibley, if you look at the region, do you think, if President Obama does not do what Dan Kurtz is suggesting, that another whole year can pass without much real change in the status quo?
Well, clearly, we have an environment of revolution in the Arab world that's ongoing. And what has become clear in this environment that while these revolutions were not at the core about the Arab-Israeli conflict or even about American foreign policy, they are very much focused now on foreign policy. And that the way Arabs evaluate American foreign policy, we've seen the polls over the past few months, Arabs still see America largely through the prism of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And there is no avoiding that. It is the prism of pain, and it's more so now because every government is far more responsive to the public opinion, and because this issue will be used, and it's an easy issue to use. We're going to witness that first in the Egyptian elections. Egypt is now in the middle of preparing for the November 28th parliamentary elections, and they're going to have the presidential elections. Undoubtedly, what happens on the Arab-Israeli conflict is going to matter. So if there's an American veto at the UN between now and then, if there is an escalation on the Gaza front between now and then, it's going to mobilize a lot of people, and it's going to influence and affect American foreign policy. It's very hard, really, for the U.S. to ignore this issue. Now, it may be that all the U.S. can do is try to maintain a quiet, meaning at least to prevent an escalation and therefore mute the impact of this issue. That may be true, and it might have an impact, and I think it could possibly be successful. I think there's an interest among the parties to be responsive. Nonetheless, I am worried ahead because I think that when you look at the Egyptian-Israeli relationship particularly, because I think it is the anchor of what might happen across the board. The Egyptians and the Israelis at the level of establishments, the Egyptian military that's still in control, want to maintain the relationship with Israel. They're cooperating with the Israelis. If you have a parliament that is elected that wants to take them on, the easiest question would be to take them on this Palestine question when there is an escalation. And if they do, and you have an elected parliament, it's going to create a real major crisis for the U.S. So I think it's going to be very hard. It's going to be a tough year for American diplomacy. It may be manageable, but it's impossible to just pretend that this issue is not going to play out in the Arab streets in the coming months.
Aaron Miller, where do you come down on this issue about whether it can just be kind of try to keep it on the back burner, or are things changing so fast?
Let me talk just for a minute, not as a peace processor, or as Secretary Baker used to refer to us as food processors, but as an American. Governing, in 20 years, I've learned that governing is about choosing. It's about setting priorities. FDR said that Lincoln died a sad man because he couldn't have everything at once. Not every president can have everything. We are now involved in the two longest wars in American history. Billions and trillions of dollars are being expended. The standard is not can we win, but how can we extricate ourselves, which for a superpower is a terrible position to be in. Our unemployment figures are over 7%. We have decaying infrastructure. We have deficit. We have debt. We're dependent on hydrocarbons. This country has a broken house which needs to be fixed. Now, I voted for Barack Obama, not because I knew who he was, but because I think that his election was a validation of a system of governance that I care deeply about. The last thing I would want to see this man do, if you are interested in the peace process, then your strategic objective during the course of the next 12 months ought to be one primary goal: re-elect the President of the United States. If you really care about the peace process, therefore, in my judgment, this man should do nothing during the course of the next 12 months on this issue that makes him vulnerable to the Republicans, produces another failure where we look feckless and weak. Everybody says no to us now without cost or consequence. Everybody. Netanyahu, Abbas, Karzai, Maliki, everybody. The Iranians, we have no street cred left. So, no, don't fail again. All right? Be calm, be patient, follow the 3 suggestions that the previous Secretary of State outlined, keep your powder dry, and then, if you really do care about this, Mr. President, you really care about it, and I'm not sure, I don't know, then make some key decisions after you have a second term. Because if we take this on now, in any serious way, Dan refers to it as a suicidal way, we will fail. Because there is no conflict-ending agreement available right now to Israelis and Palestinians.
Okay, can I just ask you a question? Is vetoing a resolution at the UN doing nothing? Is cutting off aid to international organizations doing nothing? Is cutting off aid to the Palestinian Authority doing nothing? What is doing nothing?
There are 3 separate issues you've just mentioned. One has statutory implications by law, and the other 2 are political in nature. I
think Shibley's point is
each of them.
their actions will be forced. Right?
And we're going to have to decide, he will have to decide the balance between, well, it's the politics of diplomacy, isn't it?
You know, it's very interesting that all of us who have been messing around in the diplomatic world always end up pontificating as experts on American politics, a role that I'm very uncomfortable with. I do it too. But I don't think we really know how to get the next president. How to this president get reelected or not.
So go back to the region for us.
So let's talk about what we can do, not about how you get Obama reelected. I happen to have voted for him also.
I don't agree, and I'll tell you why. For the first time in my life in 2008, I joined a political campaign. And I campaigned for Barack Obama, and I served on his transition team. And I was focused on the Jewish community and found that we could build up support for a man who entered this campaign with tremendous liabilities in this community. Reverend Wright and the Barack Hussein Obama, and you name it. We built up his support to 78% in a community that understood, because he had been honest in saying it, that he was going to make the peace process a priority for the United States. So I don't buy this idea that we don't understand domestic politics. I met with the Jewish community in this country, 20% of whom will never vote for Barack Obama. Okay, they're not my constituency. But the 78% who did have understood that this was a man who was committed to trying to make peace between Israel and the Palestinians.
It's not all about the Jewish community. For heaven's sakes, the strongest support Israel has in this country right now is from the conservative evangelical Christians.
Well, actually, I have
That's just a partial answer.
I have polls on that.
Look, you know, I really think it's important also to mention one mistake we've made in the peace process, since this is lessons learned.
And while Sam's concluding this thought, if people want to ask questions, why don't you go to one of the mics, because then we'll be ready.
There was one lesson that we had in our previous analysis of the earlier years. I think it's still valid. Obama violated it, and he paid the price. Namely, don't raise the settlement issue until you're in a position to make it very close to a deal. The only way you're going to get the kind of reaction on settlements from Israeli government is when they are convinced that they need to make that decision to close something. Now, he decided to go after it with something that's never been tried and was never succeeded. Total freeze back in March, the first time. And that violates the corollary to this. One thing I do know about Israeli leaders and the Israeli public, American presidents have to first make sure that the Israeli public, I don't care about the Jewish, I'm not talking about the domestic side of this. In Israel, you need to convince the Israeli public that you're a friend of Israel. Basically, you're a friend. And you need to convince the leaders that you understand and sympathize with their problems. If they see you as a friend, then you can be very critical and very tough, and they will even listen and sometimes even act. If they start out by something you do early, and they're convinced that you're at best neutral and worst maybe real enemy, and you say you had this problem about Obama earlier with the voters here, then you cannot ever get them to do things they otherwise might be persuaded to do. And he missed that. I don't understand it, because he had good advisors, but they gave him the wrong advice on how to deal with Netanyahu, who was inevitably going to be very, very difficult to deal with. But he started wrong. It's very hard to ever recoup with that leader. I hope the next Israeli leader and the next Israeli president start out with our president understanding what you have to do first to make this alliance one that we can really influence, not just talk about being an ally.
All right, I'm going to go to questions. We already have hands up right here, and I guess the mics are coming down to you, I guess. I wanted people to line up, but we'll do it this way.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels, YesMap, and I have a question which I hope yields a counterintuitive
And excuse me, let me just suggest, I forgot to say, of course, we want brief questions and not statements, but also so we can get a lot of questions, why don't you direct it to no more than 2 people?
Well, anybody that wants to answer, perhaps Ambassador Kurtzer. I would be interested in knowing why you think the Palestinians sought UN statehood at this point, given precisely the point that Ambassador Miller has been making, which is that, if Barack Obama gets into power, reelected, then, what do you think was the calculation of they're going for statehood now?
Do you want to take a few? Or? Yeah. Well, it's not going for statehood. It's going for membership in international organizations, including the UN. You're sitting next to Nabil Shah. He can give you the answer, but speculatively, I can suggest that there was a great deal of frustration over the failure of the administration to bring about a serious peace negotiation based on agreed terms of reference. I think the Palestinians felt that they were being almost like a billiard ball being bounced around on the table. First, the President of the United States says he wants a complete settlements freeze, and then he accepts something that's far less than a complete settlements freeze. He then talks about proximity talks. Palestinians bring some ideas to the talks. The Israelis bring fewer ideas. And then there's a brief period of, 19 days of direct talks, and at least in the description we heard this morning, the Israelis reportedly brought very little to those talks. And then you saw the reaction of Prime Minister Netanyahu to President Obama's May speech, in which he called for borders and security. So there's an accumulated frustration, belief that the peace process was going nowhere. And as President Abbas said in the New York Times op-ed, it was time to move the issue from the diplomatic to the legal realm, which is, potentially quite dangerous. But I think that would be a fair outside analysis of their motivation.
Yeah, can I just say, it had the impact, and don't underestimate it, it had the impact of diverting attention from what could have been an explosive situation in the Palestinian areas. Because coming in the context of the Arab Spring, no political option on the horizon, people completely frustrated, a lot of energy coming out. We saw it initially pushing for the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation. And this was a rallying issue that was political, that took away from energy that could have actually been rather disruptive and destabilizing. And it also, in the balance of power between Hamas and Fatah, it certainly gave Fatah a boost at a time when it could have gone the other way. So there was a political benefit, substantial political benefit came out of it, separate from the consequences at the UN.
Yes, sir, right there.
When I talk to friends and family.
Could you give your name and
my name is
affiliation?
Hisham Jabi. I work for Management System International in Washington. Mm-hmm. I'm originally from the West Palestine. Very soon, hopefully. How does U.S. Israel envision the scenario of Palestinian National Authority collapsing if U.S. Israel continues its efforts basically to really block the UN, of course, bid, and also cutting funding from Palestinian National Authority and also USAID and other State Departments funding?
I'm sorry, the beginning of your question was how does
U.S. Israel envision this scenario? I mean,
U.S. and Israel?
Yeah, what kind of neighbor they're looking for? If Hamas is not a good neighbor, if Iran is not a good neighbor, if Palestinian National Authority is not a good neighbor. So I'm just interested what kind of neighbor they're looking for in the West Bank.
Maybe Sam knows.
Well, the U.S. is very much against cutting off any aid to Palestine. We're lobbying against it on the Hill. The problem is the legislation is on the books, and they can't avoid cutting off aid to UNESCO. And part of the aid to Palestine is very much at risk. The Israeli question is an interesting one. How do the Israelis vision? Well, which Israelis are you talking about? A lot of Israelis are very upset and very supportive of continuing the aid. The Israeli military is in favor of continuing the aid because they don't want to have trouble. But you have a very hardline cabinet and some people in that cabinet that really just like to cut off the Palestinians and let them float out to sea. And Netanyahu is sort of balanced between these forces. And he goes one way, depending on how hard he's pushed. These actions taken the last day or two reflect the knee-jerk reaction of the right wing in the cabinet. We have to show that the warnings we gave them, if they went to the UN, if they went to UNESCO, we're going to demonstrate that that has a price. So they're trying to make them pay the price. It's a terrible strategy. It's not the American strategy, though, at all.
Next question. Let's see, right there, because you have the mic.
My name is Armin Peter. I'm from Germany and studying currently at American University. My question is about the Arab Spring, or the so-called Arab Spring. We've seen that in some countries, like in Egypt, this could bring governments into power that are not as U.S.-friendly as like Mubarak used to be. How do these uprisings influence U.S. diplomacy in the Middle East, and how could this be an impact on the peace process negotiations?
I think for the moment, and I don't know how long the moment is going to last, the space available to the United States in the wake of these transformative events, the space available to us is going to contract. Devolution of authority comes with devolution of legitimacy, and we are going to find ourselves in a very difficult position with respect to the pursuit of Arab-Israeli negotiations. I mean, we dealt for the last 50 years with two kinds of, the Arab world was divided either into Arab authoritarians or acquiescent authoritarians. And we've now witnessed the passing of both the Arab authoritarians and the Arab acquiescents. For 20 years, our first stop in the pursuit of Arab-Israeli negotiations was Cairo. The first, or Israel, but even the Israelis understood the value that Hosni Mubarak provided. And I think the absence of legitimate and strong Arab leadership in the wake of the Arab Spring, winter, whatever you want to call it, is going to be a serious constraint on our capacity to produce a process that, A, will provide the Palestinians with the cover they need to make the kinds of decisions on the core issues, particularly refugees in Jerusalem, the identity issues. It's going to deny the Israelis the assurance that they need with respect to Arab partners to induce them not to be so withholding. And it's going to pose a major problem for our diplomacy. I just don't see, in a compact period of time, how you're going to produce the kinds of support in the Arab world that we need. And the ones who are still in power, the Saudis, the Jordanians, will end up looking in the rearview mirror and wondering, when are they coming for me? And I need to be very, very careful about what I do. So the notion of risk-taking on the part of anybody during this period, the Israelis, the Arab states, and for sure the Palestinians, the weakest party, I think is going to be very much reduced.
I would, if I might, I just want to build on that because I agree with Aaron fully. It's one of the things we do agree upon. The situation, you almost have to build a matrix with what's happening in the Arab world because there is no Arab Spring. You've got several different potential trend lines. You have three countries that may be on a road to democratization, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. You've got several countries that are fighting back bitterly against the possibility of change, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain. And then you have the monarchies, the 8 monarchies, not necessarily unified, but some of them trying to find a way to accommodate change and some of them resisting change. Within that context, it's not just the differentiation of policy vis-a-vis each of the trends, but you have cross-cutting American interests. And we saw it at play in the Tahrir Square uprising. On the one hand, you want to maintain a viable and close relationship with a country like Egypt that has provided tangible national security benefits to the United States for 30 years in peace process, strategic terms, even economic transformation terms. And on the other hand, you want to encourage democratization and openness and pluralism. So your matrix of policy choices here becomes even more complicated than if you only look at the degree to which we can call on these countries for assistance in the peace process. We have counterindicative interests in each of these situations that makes policymaking extraordinarily complicated now.
Well, I have a slightly different take on it, because if you look at, sort of the impact of the Arab Spring on our politics, you look at it multiple levels. First, the public opinion level. Initially, certainly in 2 polls that we've done in April and August, the American public actually reacted relatively positively to the Arab awakening and the demonstrators. We found is that a majority of Americans now have a positive view of the Arab people. 70% have a positive view of the Egyptian people. And in part, this was because this was seen to be early on to be mostly peaceful and less ideological. So we've seen that impact that is positive in both polls. On the other hand, you have Congress, where the burning question in Congress was, how will this impact Israel? Will the Islamists win? And then in the case of Egypt, what is it going to do with the strategic military relationship? Those are the 3. And I think that while the American public may be more open, actually, by the way, a majority of the American public say that the U.S. should support democracy in the Middle East, even if it results in governments that are less friendly to the U.S. We have 55% of the public say that. That could change, in my opinion, if the environment changes. But Congress doesn't have the patience. So if you have, let's assume you have an Egyptian parliament elected is seen to be controlled by Islamists who are making statements against the U.S. and Israel. I think the instinct will be to act in a hostile fashion. I don't care what the public says or what the administration wants to do. I think that is the instinct of Congress, and so there are lots of tests coming up that could be potentially very dangerous, I think, in the relationship.
And Sam, weigh in, if you could. I'm sorry to keep turning to you as the expert on Israel public opinion here, but what do you think, is there a consensus within Israel about how this is going to affect Israel and how Israel should respond? Or is it the same duality where some say, we have to rethink the playbook, and a whole other camp is saying circle the wagons?
My sense is that the whole range of the spectrum is nervous, insecure, and unsure, and sees a lot of dangers on all sides and doesn't really know quite how to deal with it. And so they kind of fall back also every now and then on having a crisis about Iran, which is clear-cut for them. They know Iran's an enemy, a real enemy, but they're not even sure about Syria anymore. That's too complicated. And the public opinion, I think, at the moment doesn't push the government to be anything other than very cautious and try to convince the Palestinians to behave while we sort things out elsewhere.
But I mean, you wouldn't call cutting off the funding and
sending
settlements as cautious.
Well, the caution, I wouldn't do. The settlements is a separate question. That's a reaction. That's another way of sending a signal to us and to the Palestinians that they've done something that we warned you not to do, and we were going to do it anyway, but just more slowly, and now we'll show you. And it also signifies that we don't take you seriously, America, about settlements.
Next question, right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Sean Borg. I'm a student at American University. My question is, how much damage to our street cred, our credibility, does the continued support of non-democratic regimes in the region pose to us, especially in these times of uprisings? And then what can we do to actually rebuild our credibility within the region? Thank you.
Aaron.
Kick a few field goals.
I've always been very skeptical of the hearts and minds approach to public diplomacy. I think it's actually the reverse. It's not hearts and minds, it's minds and hearts. You can't just change the wrapping on the package when the contents of the package remain the same. And the reality is that our policies in this region for years now, almost across the board, are opposed by broad sectors of the Arab public and elites. Whether it's the perception that we have a double standard with respect to Israel, Iran, our policy toward Hamas, Gaza, our own policy in democratization, where we choose which Democrats we want to back. and not support the others. So now that you have a situation in which the Arab systems have opened up, and the impact of public opinion is going to be felt in a much more direct and causal way, I think our task and challenge is even going to be harder. And I'm only reporting here. I'm not advocating any change in American policy. All I'm suggesting is that if we continue to pursue the policies that we've pursued across the board, then our street cred is going to be further diminished. And if you want to do serious peacemaking, you have to be admired, respected, and even, maybe, feared. So lack of admiration, lack of respect, lack of fear produces a situation where an American president doesn't have a moment. And Iraq and Afghanistan, and the fact that we can't win there, and that we are constantly bested by small, everyday, beating big, only creates further proof of the fact in the minds of, I think, in the minds of many in the region, that we just don't have the power we once did.
So when you see both the Palestinians defying the Obama administration and going to the UN, on the other hand, you see Netanyahu continually defying the administration on settlements. I mean, Shively, do you think that the U.S. role is just seen as a less relevant one today by all the parties?
Well, you know, you focus. The example you gave, of course, is from the Palestine-Israel question.
Yes.
And that is the prism. And so, yes, that's going to matter. And I think that's a big issue because what Aaron said, I agree with, by the way, minds more than hearts. I happen to agree with that about how what you need to know, even on, let's say the U.S. is supporting dictatorships in the Middle East. Let's say the U.S. abandons them as it was seen to have abandoned Mubarak or abandoned Gaddafi or abandoned the conspiracy theorists are still going to say that whole thing is a conspiracy. That whole change is a conspiracy. So there is some prior perception that is forming their negative views of the U.S., that this issue, whether they're supportive or not, is going to vary. They were accepting of the intervention in Libya, by and large, according to my assessment of public opinion. They're not supportive of intervention in Syria. There's Arab public opinion itself is not unified on what they want from the Arab world. So the question then is, what is the prism of judgment for American foreign policy? In every single poll we've done, before the Arab Revolution, since the Arab Revolution, tells you that the Israel-Palestine question remains the prism through which people evaluate the credibility of American foreign policy over any other issue. And if you have that wrong, you could be everything else right and people will miss it or will attribute all kinds of things to you that are wrong. And I think that's one thing that our body politic has not internalized. I think we may not have come to grips with how even important it is in the Arab revolutions themselves, because when I go and talk to people, the Egyptians were chanting right after Mubarak fell in that 1 million-person demonstration the week after, "Irfa rasak inta Masri," raise your head, you're an Egyptian. The Libyans were chanting the same thing, raise your head. They were not raising their heads. And they were not talking about individually versus the government, but as a people in the context of foreign policy. And they see this issue as a core issue of humiliation, collective humiliation in every country. Don't underestimate the importance in the collective psychology of the people of this issue. I think we don't do ourselves a service in pretending like all of what's happening in the region is completely divorced from this issue. It's important to it.
But Aaron Miller and Dan, I want to come back to you on this, that to maintain or rebuild street cred, you have to be admired, respected, and I think someone chimed in here, feared. Has the U.S. really just lost that with the leadership of both, certainly on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, I think the answer is yes.
For all time, really, that we're seen as less relevant.
I don't know for all time. Look, you can go back to the transition from Clinton to Bush 43, and one of the things that President Bush, I think, correctly understood was the need to rebuild the credibility of the office of the president, which he felt had been diminished by President Clinton's over-involvement, kind of desk officer involvement in the peace process, and a peace process that failed. And I think that was the correct perception. President Bush then went off in a different direction, which I think might have been done differently. But it didn't mean, I'm being diplomatic, Sam, I'm sorry. It didn't mean that for all time we were fated to have a presidency that was weakened. I think today, as Shibley has indicated, as Aaron has indicated, we do face a very significant problem. I know people don't like to call it the Arab Street, but in the perceptions of Arab public opinion, in the perceptions of emerging leaders in places where change is underway, and the United States will have to rebuild the credibility of our power. We don't have a credibility problem on military power. We are still, by far, the paramount military power in the world. But most problems might be addressed first through diplomatic and other means, and that's where I think our efforts should be directed in the period ahead.
Right here, I promise. This, right down here in the second row.
Hope he asked you.
Oded Khaklai from Queen's
Can you
University.
give your name and affiliation?
Oded Khaklai from Queen's University in Canada. One of the consequences, perhaps unintended consequences, of the Palestinian bid to the UN was to prod an otherwise very passive Quartet and the US administration to put forth a plan, a framework, where the two sides have to reach an agreement on borders within 3 months. And somehow that has been sidelined, forgotten. And I'm wondering, why isn't that being acted upon? Isn't that a great opportunity?
It's not what the Quartet put forward. The Quartet asked for talks to be held between the Quartet and each side, that each side would prepare its views on border insecurity within 3 months. Not that an agreement would be reached. It would be wonderful if the Quartet expected an agreement to be reached in 3 months. But the Quartet now is talking about talks in order to prepare talks for the talks to continue. That's what they're doing.
I have a question right here about, actually, we're getting so low. Why don't we take 2 questions at once? So right here, and then the gentleman right back there.
Gülveda Özgür. I am a Turkish reporter based in New York. The joke at the UN, I covered the UN General Assembly when President Obama delivered his speech, is that Obama's speech was so similar with Netanyahu's that Prime Minister Netanyahu had to actually make changes in his speech. Do you agree with that? What is your assessment on that?
3 rows back.
Jacob Kurtzer with the International Committee of the Red Cross. For propriety, I'll direct this to Drs. Miller and Talhami. You alluded to it briefly, the role of Congress, but I'm curious at the nexus of leadership, public opinion, and the carrots and sticks role of the U.S. government, to what extent Congress should be held to blame for the failure of the peace process, to what extent Congress has impeded the administration, and how could a future administration get around a Congress that seems to have played an oversized role in U.S. policy in the region?
The question cuts to the core of domestic politics and Arab-Israeli peacemaking and the illusions that accompany that whole issue. The notion somehow that we are hostage to a large, gargantuan, pro-Israeli conspiracy in this country that impedes, prevents, retards American presidents and secretaries of state from doing serious diplomacy. And that Congress is somehow, to use the words of a Saudi that I know, Israeli-occupied territory. This whole conception is nothing more than an excuse to cover, it seems to me, the broader issue of failure on the part of both of the parties to do what they need. When a Secretary of State encounters an opportunity that can actually lead to a success, and a president as well, there are no domestic constraints that are powerful enough to handicap or tie down that administration. And the three successes that we've had in Arab-Israeli diplomacy over the course of the last 40 years, the disengagement agreements, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, and Madrid, that's it. Those are the three American orchestrated peace processes. Every one of those faced serious congressional and domestic public constraints. And secretaries of state and presidents, in defense and furtherance of the national interest, said, okay, what we're doing is more important. And they succeeded. And in doing so, they brought Congress around, they brought the pro-Israeli community in the United States around, and it will happen again. Domestic politics cannot impede or retard a serious effort on the part of an American secretary. One is sitting right here with firsthand experience of what happens, and he overcame it. So I don't accept it. I don't buy it. And we have to, I think, somehow free ourselves from this notion. I mean, we are Israel's best friend, but we are not and cannot be, in the course of a negotiation, Israel's attorney. And as a consequence of that, I think if in fact you have the prospects of success, no American president or secretary of state will be.
Well, I think, on Congress, Congress, it's very cheap to support Israel, very inexpensive, and it's very expensive to go against Israel. It's that bottom line. And that's not just in terms of lobbies, also in terms of public opinion. We've seen in the public opinion polls, when I ask, do you want the U.S. to lean toward Israel? Do you want the U.S. to lean toward the Palestinians? Or do you want the U.S. to lean toward neither side? Consistently, we have roughly two-thirds who say they want the U.S. to lean toward neither side. But the problem is those who say they want the U.S. to lean toward one side or the other are those who rank the issue high in their priorities. And among those, the breakdown overall is roughly been, over the whole decade, roughly either 3-1 to 5-1 in favor of Israel over the Palestinians. In the most recent poll that we've done in August, we have an interesting divide. The divide has taken place particularly on the Republican, Democrat, and Independent divide. Among independents and Democrats, you have two-thirds who want the U.S. to be leaning toward neither side. Those who want the U.S. to lean toward one side, they want the U.S. to lean toward Israel by a ratio of only 2-1, both among Democrats and independents. Among Republicans, it's 50-1, 50-1 in favor of Israel, and that is primarily because of what Sam Lewis said, which is really the evangelical right, which has emerged as the main constituency. So it's very cheap for an American politician to do it. Now, that is not, as Aaron said, and I agree with Aaron on this one, that Congress will be on automatic pilot on this one until the president makes the case to them that the national interest requires something else. And that is something that a president is going to have to do whenever. That's why, I started off with this. You have to believe this is vitally important to the U.S. If you don't, you're not going to persuade Congress if you don't believe it yourself. You're not going to put the effort to persuade Congress. For the president to be able to put the effort to go against that automatic pilot vote in Congress, it would require him putting a lot of effort into it at a time when he's trying to get the jobs bill and everything else. So yes, domestic politics matter. I don't agree that the conclusion from that is domestic politics doesn't matter. It matters a lot. It is obviously possible still with that for a president to make the case. And I think this president has not gone to Congress to make the case this issue is vitally important. The other constituency that matter in persuading Congress, in my opinion, is the military and intelligence community. When privately members are persuaded that this is very important for strategic reasons and have shown that, often their vote is switched from one or the other because otherwise they just don't have any incentive. On the Egypt case, I expect the U.S. military and intelligence community to be the biggest defender of the aid to Egypt, even as Egypt goes through a switch that will be more antagonistic to the U.S., and Congress's automatic pilot policy will be, let's cut off aid. I expect less the Obama administration to be effective. I expect more our military establishment to be more effective because they will make the case that it is vitally important to the strategic interests of the U.S.
We're just about out of time. We actually only have about 4 minutes. So I want one question and very short answers, just so we can wrap it up on. This young man's been waiting and waiting right there.
Hi, my name is Hassan. I work here at USIP. I just had a question. I wanted to get a sense from the panelists. So all this talk about all the issues involved in all of this, but the talk of settlements seems to be having an effect on the debate in some circles, two-state solution, one-state solution. I just wanted to throw that out there and get a sense from the panelists if they don't mind commenting. Thank you.
You mean, but what exactly is your question? Is the two-state solution over?
I'd like to get a sense from them if they think the two-state solution is in jeopardy, and if the one-state solution is a viable option.
And the real challenge will be answering that briefly. I'm just going to start with Sam.
One-state solution is no answer. There really is no answer except continued chaos, except a two-state solution. It's not over, but it is endangered by continuation of a long-term stalemate. And I think the settlements have something to do with that.
Since the mid-1930s, no one has come up with an alternative to the two-state solution that works, whether you call it partition or two states. Settlements obviously are not only a complication of today's diplomacy, but they will make it exponentially harder for a prime minister in the future to contemplate the kind of territorial concessions that are going to be required. Palestinians have already, we believe, come to the idea of swaps in response to major settlement blocks, but if those blocks keep expanding, then the degree of swaps, both in quantity and quality, may become impossible for a prime minister to do.
Aaron Miller.
I mean, I would only say as not the epitaph to the process, because I think that the chances there is a real possibility for a negotiated agreement if the right factors are in place.
But I mean, the question is the two-state solution now really in jeopardy?
Absolutely. And it's the only thing that offers an opportunity to unwind the proximity problem between Israelis and Palestinians and to deal with the settlements issue.
I think it's definitely in jeopardy. I mean, the only question is it now too late already or not? That's the only question. I think you find, I go back to the polling. In fact, among Israelis and Arabs across the board, most people are pessimistic that will ever happen. A majority now on both sides are pessimistic it's going to happen. But the interesting thing is still a majority think that if there is no two-state solution, there will not be either a one-state solution or the Palestinians will give up. The majority believe there will be conflict for years to come. Yeah. That's what's keeping people with the two-state solution because they don't have an alternative. Yeah.
Well, kind of a grim prospect. I thank my panelists, Shibli Tohami, Aaron Miller, Dan Kurtzer, and Sam Lewis. Thank you.
Sorry for that, Mrs. Lincoln. How was the play?